understanding of local college football 2025. So don't take this too seriously because I'll probably disagree with a lot on this list in a few months because it's called way too early for a reason. And, there's still going to be another portal in the spring, and spring practice still hasn't begun. And sadly, some players will get injured during that. But I've got Notre Dame as number one, not because they're my pick to win the national championship. Now, they might end up being my pick, but I haven't made a pick right now. But it seemed like the right team for number one right now because they finished at second last year, and Ohio State loses a lot more than Notre Dame does. Now I know Notre Dame loses Riley Leonard at quarterback, and he was a good fit for them last season. But he was really just a game manager. He was not a great thrower of the football, and I know he was a good runner, but he didn't have a whole lot of speed like Jalen Milrow did at Alabama. It was really more of like on 3rd and 3, he can get you 4 yards kind of thing. And Notre Dame returns a lot on the offensive line. They should be really good there. And their running back room is going to be one of the best in the country. And they've added in a couple of good wide receivers from the portal. So we'll see if they can be better there. But they tried to do that last year, and their wide receiver room was still only average. And on defense, they do lose some really good players, but Notre Dame's defense was so deep last year that a lot more players got a lot of playing time than just their 11 starters. So they should be ready to move into a starting role. Their defense should be really good again. Now, that defensive coordinator that left, Al Golden, was really good. So they may be down a little bit without him, but Marcus Freeman is a defensive coach himself, so you'd expect him to have the defense still really good. And Mike Denbrock comes back at offensive coordinator, who's one of the best in the country. And number two is Texas. So Texas is probably the most secure at quarterback of all of the teams that don't return their starting quarterback and didn't add a portal quarterback because they have Arch Manning. And still, though, just because Arch Manning is a five-star quarterback that played well when he started a couple of games last season doesn't mean that you can just assume that he's going to be a Heisman quarterback with 5,000 yards of offense this coming season. I think he's got a good chance to be as good or better than Quinn Ewers was. And Quinn Ewers last year, even though he wasn't as good as he was expected to be, he was not a bad quarterback at all. He was good, just not great. So if Manning can be as good as him, even Texas should be in really good shape again this season because even though they do lose some really good players on defense, they've got an All American player possibly at every position on their defense. But Arch Manning only played against bad teams as a starter last year. The only SEC game he started in was Mississippi State, and they had one of the worst defenses in the country last year. And Texas should have a really good running back room, but their offensive line, I think, is going to take a step back because they have to pretty much completely rebuild. It and at wide receiver, they've got plenty of talent, but they need to get more production out of their wide receivers. But Steve Sarkisian is one of the best offensive coaches in all of college football, and they return Pete Wanowski at defensive coordinator, who's a top five defensive coordinator in the country. And at number three is Ohio State. So even though Ohio State could possibly end up with a better regular season record than last year, their ceiling I think is lower this year than it was last year, even though it's still high because they lose so much. They only have three starters coming back on defense, and they're having to replace two really good running backs. Now, their wide receiver room is going to be really good again, and their offensive line does lose a lot too, and they're going to be starting probably Julian Sayin at quarterback, and he's a five-star, but he was only the third string quarterback last year. He's barely played any college football, but they're still one of the most talented teams in the country. But they are going to have a hard time, I think, replacing two really good coordinators because Skip Kelly also left too. And at number four is Georgia. So Georgia has to replace pretty much their whole front seven of the defense this year. And normally, as good as Georgia's defense is everywhere, the front seven is their biggest strength. But this year, I think it might be the secondary because they do have quite a bit coming back in the secondary. But Kirby Smart, I would trust to have a good defense this year still. And Glenn Schumann comes back at defensive coordinator, and he's one of the best in the country at that. And I'm not a big fan of Georgia's offensive coordinator, Mike Bobo. Now, is he a bad offensive coordinator? No, but I don't think he's elite, and I think their offense is somewhat limited with him calling plays. But Gunnar Stockton, I thought played pretty well in what I did see of him last year, which really wasn't a whole lot. So you can't really just assume that he's going to be as good as Carson Beck was for Georgia. But I think he has a pretty high ceiling. But Georgia has to also completely nearly rebuild their offensive line. So they could be down there. And they probably will be down a little bit on defense, even though they are really well coached. But I like their wide receiver room. They added a couple of good transfer wide receivers. But the running back room doesn't seem to be as good as it usually is. And number five, I've got Penn State. So Penn State, I think it is going to be really good, but the problem is James Franklin can't seem to win the big game, so that's why I don't have them higher than this. But they return four out of five starters on the offensive line. That was one of the best in the country last year, and they're going to have maybe the best running back room in the country this year. And they've tried to fix their wide receiver problem with the portal, bringing in a couple of wide receivers that were good where they came from. But Penn State always seems to have a problem at the wide receiver position. So we'll have to wait and see with that. But Disaster Aller comes back at quarterback, and I don't think he was very good. Really, just an average quarterback in my opinion. But they've got a lot coming back on defense. Their defense should be one of the best in the country again, and The Jim Knowles hire from Ohio State at defensive coordinator was a really good hire, but I don't really think that's going to be what makes Penn State be able to win big games because uh, Penn State's defense has never really been their problem. It's been their offense, and their offense has never really been bad, but it's usually struggled to do much against really good defenses. Now, their offensive coordinator comes back for a second season, and their offense did improve a little bit last year. And uh, six, I've got Oregon. Oregon, I think, will have Dante Moore starting at quarterback for them this season. He was with them this past season as a backup. He's a five-star quarterback, and he actually does have some college starting experience because he first began his college career at UCLA and started some games for them at quarterback in 2023, but he was not very good there. So quarterback is questionable, and the wide receiver unit I think will be down from where it's been uh, so far under Dan Lanning, but their running back room I think is going to be really good. But they are going to have to pretty much rebuild their offensive line, so they'll probably be down a little bit there. But they do have quite a bit coming back on the defensive side of the ball, and Dan Lanning returns both of his coordinators who are really good. He returns Will Stein at offensive coordinator for his third season, and he returns Tosh Lupoa or whatever his name is for his fourth season as their defensive coordinator. He's been with Oregon ever since Dan Lanning has been there, and Oregon did really well in the transfer portal, and Dan Lanning has been recruiting at a very high level for years there now. And number seven is Clemson. So Clemson right now would be my pick to win the ACC. They've upgraded at defensive coordinator, bringing in Tom Allen, who was Penn State's defensive coordinator this past season when they had one of the best defenses in the country, and they've got quite a bit coming back on the defensive side of the ball. They should be better there. And Cade Klubnik is one of the best returning quarterbacks in college football. And Garrett Riley will be back at offensive coordinator. He improved their offense by quite a bit this past season in his second season as their offensive coordinator. And Dabo Sweeney added three players in the portal this off season, and running back is a concern, but they are loaded at the wide receiver position this year. And at number eight, I've got Michigan. So Michigan should be upgraded at quarterback this year. They wouldn't really have to do much to be upgraded as bad as they were. But they've got a couple of options. They brought in a transfer quarterback, and they've got a five-star true freshman coming in. Bryce Underwood is his name, one of the top recruits uh, of this recruiting class. I don't know though who will be the starter yet, but their running back room should be good, and they've got a lot coming back on their offensive line. So they should have more of a Michigan-like offensive line this coming season. Now, wide receiver is still a big concern for them, but they've got a lot coming back on the defensive side, so they should be good on defense again, but probably still not at the level of 2023's defense. And number nine, I've got Alabama. So Alabama has still got one of the most talented rosters in the country, and Kalen DeBoer, I think, is a good coach, but uh, even if he is, that still doesn't mean that he's for sure a good fit for Alabama. But what he did at Washington was really impressive. That's why I think he is a good coach. And their wide receiver room I really like, but quarterback is a concern. I don't know yet who will be the starter. Right now, my guess would be Ty Simpson. But their running back room, I think, it may not be quite as good, losing Justice Haynes, but they should still be solid there. And they've got quite a bit coming back on their offensive line. And Kalen DeBoer has upgraded at offensive coordinator, bringing in his old offensive coordinator from the 2 years that he was at Washington, who did a really good job. His name is Ryan Grubb. He was going to go with DeBoer to Alabama this past season, but decided to go somewhere else. And Alabama's defense does have quite a bit of talent coming back. I think they're a contender to win the SEC this year. And at number 10 is LSU. So you might think because I ranked Brian Kelly number 6 in my top 10 head coaches video that I'm a big fan of his, but that's actually not true. I just did that because of how consistently good his teams have been when he's been a head coach for so long. But if LSU is wanting to be at or near the top of the SEC every year, I don't think Brian Kelly is the coach for them. He's the coach for them if they want to consistently win 9 or 10 games a year. But if Ed Orgeron could not only win a national championship at LSU, but have at least the second best college football team of all time, I'd have to say Brian Kelly at least has a chance to win a national championship there because Ed Orgeron never had the kind of consistency that Brian Kelly has had. But I'm not a big fan of their offensive coordinator. Now, their defensive coordinator did improve their defense by some this past season. Their defense was a little bit above average, and I do like their line backers, and they've redone their defensive line through the transfer portal. But the secondary has still been a big issue for LSU, and this year they have to pretty much completely rebuild their offensive line. That's been one of the big strengths for them the past couple of seasons. They'll probably be down on the offensive line, but Garrett Nussmeier might be the best quarterback in the SEC this year. He'll be one of the best quarterbacks in the country, and their wide receiver room is really good. And running back, though, I don't think is great, but they should be solid there. And at number 11 is Miami. So this is really because they got Carson Beck. Miami's wide receiver room has lost a whole lot. Everybody that did very much for them last year is gone, and they'll probably be down a little bit at running back, but they do have a lot coming back on the offensive line, and their defense, I think, should be a little bit better this year at least, and it badly needs to be if they're actually going to win anything big because Miami's defense was very bad last year. If you look at their average points given up per game, it's pretty deceiving because they didn't give up hardly any points to the little teams they played, but gave up a ton of points to most of the ACC teams they played that weren't even that good. But they'll be one of the top contenders to win the ACC this year. And then number 12 is BYU. So BYU, I'm not real confident can repeat what they did last year, but I put them at the top of the Big 12 instead of Arizona State, who I've got at 13 because Arizona State loses Scatterboo. which was really the big reason why they won the Big 12 last year. And BYU doesn't lose a player as valuable as he was for Arizona State, but BYU does lose quite a bit. But they do return their quarterback and their coach. And Arizona State, they do return a lot on defense, and they return their quarterback Sam Levitt and Jordan Tyson, one of the best wide receivers in the country. And at 14, I've got Iowa State. So Matt Campbell is a really good coach, and he just got Iowa State to their best season ever this past season, winning 11 games. And Rocco Beck comes back at quarterback, and he is one of the most experienced quarterbacks in the country now. He'll be a third year starter, has had two pretty good years at Iowa State. And their wide receiver room, I think, is going to be down, but the running back room should be good. And they've got quite a bit coming back on the defensive side. They're for sure a contender to win the Big 12 this year. And then 15, I've got Texas A&M. So Mike Elko, I think, is a good coach, and I think Colin Klein is a good offensive coordinator, and I think their quarterback Marcel Reed should be one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC this year. I think he's got a very high ceiling because he's a great runner and a great passer. And this might be too big of a comparison, but he reminds me a lot of Lamar Jackson when he was in college. Now, Marcel Reed right now is not as good as Lamar Jackson, but I think he's a similar type of quarterback. And A&M does lose quite a bit off of the defense that was good, but not great last year. But they're going to have one of the best running back rooms in the country, and they return all five starters on the offensive line, and they've filled some holes on their defense with the portal. So I think they should be improved in Mike Elko's second year. And then 16, I've got Ole Miss. So Ole Miss loses a ton. Their defensive line is going to have to be completely redone. They'll probably take a pretty big step back there. And probably in the secondary too. They've got to pretty much completely redo that. Also, their defense is going to take a step back this year, but Pete Golding is a great defensive coordinator, and Lane Kiffin has done well again in the portal, and I trust him as a coach. And Austin Simmons will probably be the starting quarterback, but like I said with Arch Manning, you can't be sure just because the quarterback played pretty well from what you saw of them the year before as a backup that they're going to have a great year. And from what I saw of Austin Simmons last year, especially in that touchdown drive that he led against Georgia, he looked pretty good to me. But their wide receiver room is going to be really good again, and I think their run game could be better. And number 17 is Tennessee. So it's hard to imagine Tennessee being as good as they were this past season, this season. Because even though Nico, I'm about to leave you, comes back, he was solid last year, but he was not like a Heisman type of quarterback, not even close. Now he might improve some this year, but they lose a lot in their wide receiver room, and Dylan Sampson is gone, and he was most of their offense last year, and they lose a lot on the offensive line, and they also lose quite a bit on defense too. But they should still be a solid team with Josh Heupel coaching them. He's a good coach. And number 18 is Indiana. So this is really just me giving a Coach Cignetti the benefit of the doubt because they do lose a lot from last year's team, and Indiana has not been a good college football program. That was the best team they've ever had this past season. But Coach Cincinnati is a really good coach. He's a proven winner, and he did do well enough in the portal that I still think Indiana has a chance to at least be a top 25 team, but probably not a playoff team again. And number 19, I've got Illinois. So Brett Bielema is really unpredictable. Like in 2022, Illinois wasn't expected to be any good, but they won 8 games. And then in 2023, they were expected to be pretty good and they were awful. And then in 2024, they weren't expected to be any good, but then they won 10 games. So I'm not very confident Illinois will be able to repeat that kind of success this coming season. This is more because of what they did last year, why I've got them ranked. But they do have quite a bit coming back from last year's team. And number 20 is South Carolina. I also am not real confident in them being able to repeat the success they had last year. But Lenore Sellers comes back at quarterback. He should be one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC. He played better than I thought he would last year, and their defense does lose a lot, but they do still have some really good athletes on both sides of the ball, like Dylan Stewart on the defensive line is one of the best pass rushers in the country. And at number 21 is at Kansas State. So Avery Johnson comes back at quarterback, and I like him, and I like their coach, Chris Kleiman, and Kansas State should be solid on defense, and they're going to have a really good run game. They're for sure a contender to win the Big 12 this year, and I think it was unfair that they weren't ranked in the final rankings last year because even though they lost 4 games, I thought they were a pretty good team, and they're one of the most consistent teams now. And at 22, I've got Louisville. I also think they should have been ranked. I thought even though they played in a weak conference like Kansas State did and lost 4 games, they were a good team too. And Jeff Blum is a good coach, and him and Miller Moss, I think it will be a great match this season. And even though they did lose a lot, he's filled most of the holes with the transfer portal. Louisville, I think, is a contender to win the ACC this year. In 23, I've got SMU. So SMU, I'm not really confident can have as good of a year as they did this past season because they lose a whole bunch of good players. But Jennings does come back at quarterback, and he had a good year last year. And the ACC just is not very good, so SMU would have to be on the contenders list, I think, after what they did this past season. They almost won the conference. And 24, I've got Oklahoma. So Oklahoma does have a halo coming back on their offensive line, and I know their offensive line was horrible last year, but you can't just assume because the horrible offensive linemen from the past season are coming back that they're going to be horrible again. Because, for example, South Carolina was terrible in 23, and they had a terrible offensive line that gave up 40 something sacks, and they had one of the worst run games in the country because of them, and went 5-7 that year. But then they had pretty much the same offensive line come back the next year, and they won 9 games, and their pass protection was so much better, and so was their run game. But Oklahoma would have to have a big improvement like that on the offensive line for them to be a contender in the SEC this year. But John Mateer, I think, should be one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC. And their defense, even though they do lose their 2 best players, returns a whole lot. They're loaded on that side of the ball again, and Brent Venables is taking over play calling on the defense. And when he was at Clemson, he was one of the best in the country at that. So I think Oklahoma should be quite a bit improved at this coming season. And then 25, I've got Nebraska. So Matt Rule, because he's been building up that program, I think it's about time for them to actually have a good year. And Dana Holgerson, I think, was a good hire, offensive coordinator, and their defense, I think, should be pretty good again. And their offensive line is upgraded, I think, because they brought in two really good offensive linemen from the transfer portal, and they've upgraded at wide receiver through the portal too. And Dylan Raiola should be better at quarterback in year two, so they should have a better offense this year. Even though I think their defense might be the worst since Matt Rule has been there. But that will be it with this video. Please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.